The 2015 Canada Goose Management Strategy for Mount Arrowsmith Biosphere Region was written over a 3-year period and informed by data collected over nearly 3 decades. To create the strategy, we used more than 4,700 resites of 296 geese, banded and collared on 3 estuaries from 2008 through 2012. There were more than 12,000 survey records and more than 1,600 nest records. Let's look for a moment how we came to have too many geese. It's a myth that geese became a problem because they stopped migrating. Beginning in the 1950s, enthusiastic wildlife managers in eastern North America began relocating Canada geese and enhancing habitats to grow their populations. This assisted migration spread like a wave westward, and it went on for decades. When populations began to get troublesome for farmers or municipalities, unwanted geese would be transplanted somewhere else, and the problem would repeat over and over again. Once a small population was established, a phenomenon known as site fidelity, the tendency to return over and over again to the same places, ensured it would continue to grow. Young breeding females in particular returned to nest at or near their birthplace, fostering exponential growth. When this growth began impacting conservation lands, members of the Guardians of Mid-Island Estuaries Society and others took it upon themselves to do something about it. All agreed it was pointless to restore the estuaries without doing something about the geese that were causing the damage. Concerned stakeholders met to talk about Canada geese in 2000. The first egg addling in the biosphere region began in 2002, but to do more, the Canadian Wildlife Service required the science. There were concerns for the dusky Canada goose, a provincially red-listed subspecies, often identified by its dark breast, and for the blue-listed cackling goose, a look-alike that is considerably smaller than most of our geese, which are mainly large-bodied hybrids. This management strategy is the science. It includes scientifically based management solutions to reduce and control locally overabundant Canada goose populations. So what did we find? First, that our so-called resident geese weren't all residents, or even year-round residents. Our birds were found in California, Oregon, and Washington, Alberta, on the Lower Mainland, or other parts of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. There were 14 different migrant types, here amalgamated into 8. The true local resident is on the left, 22.3% of all marked birds. For management purposes, we can categorize them as full and part-time residents, in-migrants, and out-migrants. Just to give you a flavor for where these birds are going, here is the distribution of our marked birds during the spring migration period. The color shows where they're banded. Pink for the Little Qualicum River Estuary, yellow for the Englishman River Estuary, and blue for the Craig Creek Estuary. The second major finding was that we have subpopulations comprised of different blends of migrant types. These correspond roughly to the areas where they were banded. For example, the Englishman River subpopulation, in yellow, had a high percentage of local residents, whereas Craig Creek had more molt migrants, birds that come to the area to molt or regrow their flight feathers. Little Qualicum birds have the least number of local residents, but the most emigrants. This is important because each subpopulation may benefit from a focused management plan. We also have hotspots for geese, namely the 3 estuaries and the city of Parksville. Geese use the estuaries year-round. During the growing season, they overgraze the marshes. At other times of year, they grub the roots and rhizomes along channel edges, exposing the thick marsh platform to erosion. Built up over millennia, this platform has washed away in many areas. Channels have become shallow, and productive habitats have been reduced to gravel. Here we have a goose nest on a chunk of remaining marsh platform at the Englishman River Estuary. The remaining photos show the transition at the Little Qualicum River Estuary. Some of the plant communities at these estuaries are provincially designated as at risk of extinction. Geese are also known to impact seagrass beds and nearshore Garry Oak ecosystems, which are also sensitive, vulnerable, and ecologically significant. There are other goose-related problems in the region. One is fouling, something soccer players and school children know very well, and fouling can be quite serious. In response to concerns and complaints, the Canadian Wildlife Service commissioned a health risk assessment in 2010 that found that there was insufficient data to conduct a meaningful assessment. Among other things, the risk assessment recommended fecal waste management, especially for children and people who are immune compromised. It's noteworthy that island health inspectors have found nothing significant in local water samples taken from popular beaches. However, other areas remain unsampled. And we don't test sand. Bacteria persist in sand longer than they do in water. We conducted a small survey of stakeholders and were surprised to learn that geese had truly diminished the quality of life of area residents. Geese kept people from places and activities they once enjoyed. Geese had affected tourism and recreation-focused businesses. Crops were depredated, and farmers had incurred considerable costs for mitigation and damages. People were concerned about water resources, shellfish contamination, and impacts to farm animals and pets. Golf courses and other landscaped areas were damaged and fouled. Aircraft were at risk. So what can we do? First, learn from the past. This is a pretty sparse graph, and it has many problems. It starts in the late 80s after the population had already expanded. A foggy November 2005 count prompted a do-over, and surveyors found many more birds in January. We know now January is a better time to assess peak overwintering numbers. New survey areas were added over time. The only years that were completely comparable were 2012 and 2013. Even the last bar in 2014 shows a peak that was attributed in part to additional survey areas. Yet this graph tells us something important, that addling since 2002, changes in hunting seasons in 1998 and 2007, and higher bag and possession limits in 2012 have been unable to bring the regional population down to the levels we saw in the 80s. It's also notable that these numbers, which are nothing compared to the tens of thousands of geese you might see on a single field on the prairies, are enough to damage our estuaries and cause havoc in our communities. So where are the birds during the overwintering season? During the daytime, they're in the Little Qualicum and Englishman River estuaries, they're in town, they're everywhere. At night, we know they roost in the Craig Creek estuary. There are large flocks in farmers' fields. Local geese act like decoys, drawing in the migrants. But there's another peak period, during the molt. 1,500 birds were here in July 2014. And where were they? All along the coastline, and at some freshwater sites. The pie graph reiterates that the greatest densities of geese are in marine, estuarine, and freshwater habitats. This is the time of the year when the eelgrass takes a beating, but it offers a reprieve to playgrounds and other terrestrial sites. Egg addling, often challenging and sometimes dangerous. It's often the first tool used to manage geese. In the 14 plus years of this on-again, off-again program, we addled more than 5,000 eggs, translating to more than 2,000 breeding birds. Using a very rough calculation, 6,000 additional eggs have been prevented from adding to our regional population each year. While we appear to have made some headway at the Little Qualicum River estuary, with the numbers of nests going down each year since 2010, we are losing ground elsewhere. Hunting is promoted as the #1 management option. 21% of our marked geese were shot. 68% were killed here, consistent with the notion that most birds are shot close to where they're banded. And the graph shows us that if you're a Little Qualicum bird, your chances of getting shot are considerably higher than if you're from Englishman or Craig Creek. And of the birds that were shot elsewhere, 72% were never seen on huntable sites here. This suggests we need to work with other jurisdictions if we want to effectively manage Canada geese. The Guardians would like to see more hunting. There are several ways to make this happen. First, evaluate Canada geese for an overabundance designation. Further reduce hunting restrictions, as hunters have reported that increased bag and possession limits have motivated them to hunt. Encourage more people to hunt, and encourage landowners to open up their properties to hunting wherever it is safe to do so. The City of Port Alberni temporarily lifted a ban on the discharge of firearms in the Somas River estuary to allow designated hunters to shoot Canada geese. Something similar could be considered in our region. The European Network on Invasive Alien Species has a slogan, "If you can't beat 'em, eat 'em." The TV show Moose Meat and Marmalade, based in Victoria, promotes the respectful use of wild game and local ingredients to create really good food. We believe the best way to manage Canada geese is to use more of them for food. We can also augment hunting and addling with other management techniques. Most of these are trial and error. What works on one site may not work on another. The City of Parksville created a goose-unfriendly fence line along the beach, which helps keep geese out of the adjacent community park during the flightless period. Unfortunately, it doesn't do much when they can fly over it. Making sites less welcoming to geese is challenging. These geese were drinking out of a parking lot puddle after feeding on a weedy lawn. This suggests to me that they aren't very picky. Hazing, for example, by dogs, is often said to move the problem to somewhere else. It's important to note that most management techniques do this, including hunting and addling, which is why goose management should be a coordinated effort. Culling is always a sensitive topic. It has been used in other jurisdictions, most recently in the CRD, but the U.S. story is particularly interesting. Capture and euthanasia have been undertaken by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and culled geese are typically donated to food banks. The USDA works on a cost-reimbursable basis. There are also state-funded control programs that include culling. Here in Canada, other wild game have been culled, processed, donated, and even sold and exported. Revisions to the migratory birds regulations are being considered that make it easier for culled meat to be consumed. We also anticipate regulations that allow First Nations to harvest birds and eggs year-round and to trade and sell them among Indigenous communities. A Made in BC solution may also be possible, according to a representative of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. If the provincial inspection system took the lead and donated meat remained in the province, changes to the federal inspection system would be unnecessary, he said. Using culled birds for food makes culling more palatable to some people. Pun intended. The Guardians believe that the senior government should take the lead in goose management. They are best positioned to coordinate actions among regional groups that are managing overlapping populations and with U.S. jurisdictions dealing with very similar issues. As regulators, they can amend legislation and set policy to better control these populations, streamline permitting processes, and provide technical expertise towards the humane reduction of our goose populations. Many communities and ecosystems across the globe are challenged with managing Canada geese. Learning from the successes and failures of others is low risk, cost-effective, and otherwise prudent. Local governments and conservation organizations, among others, cannot afford to manage geese on their own. It's critical that resources are dedicated and pooled over an agreed-upon time frame. Currently, population objectives are the same for areas that have always supported breeding Canada geese and those that have not. They're the same for areas that have 2,000 hunters or 200. The process for setting population objectives for temperate nesting Canada geese should be changed to reflect the ability of habitats to support them. Hunting is still considered the most acceptable and inexpensive management tool. An overabundance designation, which allows for exceptional hunting measures and equipment, should be used in concert with efforts to open up new areas to hunting and encourage more people to hunt. Finally, a standardized monitoring program with indicators will help assess the efficacy of management programs, better inform population models, and predict future challenges and opportunities. In Ontario, the Canadian Wildlife Service has modeled the provincial temperate breeding population and is using the results to improve management and monitoring programs. A similar model is recommended here, encompassing multiple regions and overlapping goose populations and subpopulations. And most importantly, if you can't beat 'em, eat 'em.